Okay, hello and welcome to our first lecture on Dave Schmitz's book Elements of Justice and the first element of justice, desert. This is the reading for this week, or that this lecture covers, 3 to 70. Now, the purpose of this set of slides is to introduce you to the section of the course on desert. We're going to talk about desert, both Schmitz's discussion and then various other views, and try to give some context on Schmitz's view. Now, Elements of Justice is not a textbook in the sense that it presents you with a broad overview of a discipline or even the best and most up-to-date work in the discipline. It's an example of a book of political theory and political philosophy. It offers a view on the subject. It tries to defend that view by offering reasons to believe the view, reasons to doubt rival views. We're going to encounter some of these rival views later in the course. You should be reading Schmitz critically. You should be testing the arguments as you read. You should be reading, in other words, without accepting unquestionably what he's telling you. I really wouldn't accept everything that he says. I would be surprised if you did. So my assigning this book isn't an endorsement of his views, but one thing I do endorse is his method of inquiry. Schmitz argues in an open, honest, and truth-seeking way. He doesn't shy away from difficulty. He comes up with what he thinks are some of the best reasons in favor of his case, but ultimately he leaves it up to us to decide whether we're persuaded by his views. And ultimately, that's the kind of reasoning that I'm hoping from you in your essays in the course. I also like, from a pedagogical point of view, that Schmitz is liberal in some things and conservative in others, so he's hard for students to dismiss out of hand or to pigeonhole. He has clearly political views, but on the left-right spectrum, he's got something for everybody. Let me talk a little bit about Schmitz's method of inquiry. Schmitz calls himself a contextual functionalist. What does that mean? Well, that means he believes that moral rules and principles derive from the need to meet human and social purposes. That's the functionalist part, right? Meet human and social purposes or functions. And he also thinks that which rules we choose depends on the circumstance and the context we need them in. That's the contextualism here. This kind of view is actually not uncommon among philosophers. The idea that norms are ultimately created or developed to help us pursue goals, deal with particular situations or characteristic problems, that kind of idea is pretty common. It also helps us understand why norms vary across contexts, right? The norms of the International Society of States and the norms that we have between individuals within states can and ought to be different because the context in which or the problems that we're trying to solve at each of these levels are different, right? The context is different, the human social purposes are different, and so the norms and the rules are also going to be different. Now, I think this approach explains why he selects the elements of justice that he does. These elements respond to basic human purposes, like being able to trust and cooperate with one another, survive and thrive, incentivize contributions to common projects. These are sort of the basic problems of human social organization, and we've come up with the term justice to describe the kinds of rules that help regulate that enterprise, right, or those different kinds of enterprise. It also helps him explain why, as we move from one context to another, different principles acquire more or less importance. For example, and this is an example he uses in the book, when we're dealing with children and dependents, we focus more on their needs. Now, that doesn't mean we don't care about them becoming more self-sufficient or helping them reciprocate, but in this particular context, making sure that people get what they need, in part because these are people, children and dependents, who have a hard time meeting their needs on their own, we focus on those specific principles. Again, the context dictates the relative weight that we're going to give to different principles of justice. Now, some accounts of justice or accounts of ethics try to reduce all moral decisions that one could make to one principle. You need some yardstick, and they find one yardstick and they apply it across the board. So utilitarians, for example, are famous for reducing all moral questions to the question, what will maximize net aggregate pleasure, right? that's sort of a basic utilitarian yardstick, and then we can decide whether specific rules, specific acts, specific states, end states are maximizing the aggregate pleasure or not. Now, I think these kinds of views can be fairly called monist, from the Greek root mono, meaning one, right? They reduce all evaluation to one clear yardstick. That has the advantage of a certain kind of moral clarity. Once we have the right yardstick, we can basically answer every ethical question, and that is, in some sense, comforting. Now, Schmitz's view is not monist. Schmitz is a pluralist, which means, unlike monist views, he thinks that there's more than one independent yardstick, more than one measure by which we can decide whether something is just or not. Now, this means that all things considered judgments, that is to say, ultimately what we should do, is a process of balancing competing principles in specific contexts, in specific cases, right? Deciding how to balance means acquiring an understanding of what the point of the activity is. So which principles we should use in any given context depends on the context, depends on what we're trying to achieve, what the point of the context is. So he uses an example throughout the book. The main point of a foot race is to evaluate relative speed. We hold races because we want to know who's fastest. So whatever rules that we decide for how to run a foot race crucially depend on why we run foot races, right? Why we have races. Everybody starting from an equal starting point makes perfect sense when the point is to evaluate relative speed. And rules about false starts and pushing and shoving and things like that are all related to the fact that if we allow pushing and shoving, or if we allow people to have as many false starts as they want, we are going to make it harder to evaluate relative speed. And so the rules of a foot race ultimately depend on the context, right? The purpose for which we have foot races. So this balancing idea, this idea that we have to balance different principles of justice, isn't uncommon or new or distinctive about Schmitz. We can go all the way back to Aristotle's description of justice as practical wisdom, the practical wisdom to balance different virtues, right? Aristotle is concerned with the idea of a kind of mean, a golden mean, where we don't want to go too far in either direction. That in some ways is similar to Schmitz's approach. Schmitz is not an Aristotelian by any means, but he borrows this notion of balancing. Schmitz, like Aristotle, thinks that most of our difficult ethical decisions, the one where we're torn, the ones where we see the merits of both sides, most of these tough ethical decisions consist of struggles to balance competing principles, right? We have principles that tell us to do different things, and it's hard sometimes to figure out which ones we should follow or how we should balance different competing imperatives. So let's talk about desert. We've talked about the Schmitz's method for a minute. Let me introduce the idea of desert. Desert is the first of Schmitz's 4 elements of justice. It's worth noting desert is not universally accepted as a foundational principle for justice. I couldn't find an easy reading with a sustained critique of the idea of desert, so I'm going to summarize myself the competing views in a set of slides, problems with desert. I also give you a reading by Robert Nozick, which implicitly rejects desert as a kind of pattern principle. More on that in a different lecture. There are basically 2 critiques of desert. I don't want to get too far into it, but one of those critiques finds that desert lacks foundations. It says that at the end of the day, everything we do is dependent on circumstances over which we had no choice, and therefore it's nonsense to say that we deserve anything, because ultimately all claims of desert rest on morally arbitrary foundations. There's another view that sees distribution according to desert as way too much of an interference with individual freedom, right? Where if we distribute according to merit, we're going to license interventions in people's individual decision makings when they distribute not according to merit. But again, more on that later. Even if you agree with desert, even if you agree with Schmitz that people getting what they deserve is definitely part of any theory of justice worth its salt, Some parts of Schmidt's views are probably more conventional than others. Schmidt's view of dessert itself, even if you agree that dessert matters, doesn't have to be the one that you endorse. Again, some parts of his view are more conventional than others, and if you read the text in detail, you'll see where he says, well, I'm not sure about this, I'm pretty sure about this stuff, but I'm less sure about this other stuff. I think the most speculative part of your reading is the promissory notion of dessert. The view that sometimes we can deserve something at time t in virtue of what we do after time t. In other words, that we can deserve now what we have not yet supplied the dessert-making inputs. If none of that makes sense, don't worry. Schmitz explains it way better than I ever could. But just to alert you to the fact that just because you agree with Schmitz in part doesn't mean that you can't disagree with him in part as well. Okay, so that's my introduction to this week on dessert. Yeah, enjoy the readings and feel free to ask me any questions if and when they arise.